morning, everybody. Welcome to the Asia Society and to this Asia Society Institute program, Navigating Challenges and Opportunity in Japan's Womenomics. I'm Rorry Daniels. I'm the Managing Director of the Asia Society Policy Institute, and I'm delighted to have so many people here in the audience today to talk about what is a critical issue, not just for governments to address, but also for whole of society efforts to ensure that there are equal opportunities for women in the workplace, not just in Japan, but around the world. This event is part of Asia Society Policy Institute's Emerging Female Leaders program. And we have with us here today 8 emerging female leaders from Japan who are in the U.S. for a study tour to build skills in their networks and to talk to each other about some of the challenges facing women in the workplace in Japan. This aims to deepen participants' understanding of how the U.S. trade, economic, and foreign policies are shaped and developed, as well as advancing their careers. It's a particularly timely moment to talk about Japan's efforts at women's advancement. Last fall, Japanese Prime Minister Kishida made a significant move by appointing 5 women to his cabinet, notably including the first female foreign minister in 21 years. And beyond that, he has also set an ambitious target of achieving 30% representation of women in executive positions within prime-listed companies by 2030. These are such a positive step, but there remains a lot of challenges to advancing women's participation in the workforce throughout all levels of career development. And we have with us 3 wonderful speakers to kind of unpack some of those challenges, to identify the opportunities and to give their own recommendations based on their experience for how we can move this issue forward. I'd like to introduce them now. Immediately to my left is Akiko Yamahara. Akiko is the Global General Counsel for Citi Global Wealth. She's also a steering committee member for Asian Heritage Network and represents Citi at the National Women's Law Center as a Leadership Advisory Council member. And if that weren't enough, she also serves on the Board of Overseers at Temple University, Japan, where she used to teach at the law school. Next to Akiko is our own Vice President for International Trade at the Asia Society Policy Institute, Wendy Cutler. Wendy comes to us after a distinguished career in government, including serving most recently as the Deputy U.S. Trade Representative, where she negotiated a range of bilateral, regional, and multilateral trade initiatives, including CORUS, the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, back when the U.S. was still involved, many U.S.-China negotiations, and the WTO financial services negotiations. So Wendy is not only an expert in the trade field, but has risen through the ranks and achieved wonderful accomplishments despite an overwhelming or a lack of representation of women in that field. And finally, last certainly not least, we have with us Joshua Walker. Joshua has been serving as the president and CEO of the Japan Society since 2019, and he comes to Japan Society with 2 decades of experience in international business diplomacy, including positions at Eurasia Group, APCO, the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. He also has his own significant government experience working in both the state and defense departments here in the United States. So I'm going to ask several questions to our distinguished panelists, and then we'd like to open the floor to questions from the audience. Please start thinking about, what points of inquiry you'd like to address with our panel as we continue this discussion. Akiko, I'd like to start with you. You have such an interesting career, and I'd be curious for you to just give us a sense of the trajectory of that career. How has it taken you through various positions, and what have you learned from this multifaceted career about the challenges that exist for women in the workplace and how they can be overcome?
Thank you. And first of all, thank you, Wendy, for having me here. It's such an honor to be here to speak in front of the guests from Japan and everyone else from Asia Society. So thank you so much. I am a lawyer qualified in New York, not in Japan. So I started my career in New York working for big law firms here and was working in the New York office here, then Tokyo office, and then Hong Kong office at the law firm. And everybody now knows what SARS is because of COVID. We've all sort of started to compare SARS versus COVID in the beginning of COVID pandemic. So when SARS hit Hong Kong, we left to go back to Tokyo. And that's when I joined Citi in the Tokyo office. And since then, I've moved to Citi London and then Citi in New York. So I've been here now 11 years. And half of my career in the beginning was covering investment banking business and doing a lot of transactions, IPOs on New York Stock Exchange and things like that. And the other latter half so far has been on the private banking and wealth management business. So having worked in different locations, the Citi has presence in over 90 countries. We have 240,000 people. And so the more places you've worked in, the more understanding you have of the different business sensitivities in the local cultures. And that sort of helped me through my career, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, working through multiple locations and learning all of those different kind of societal aspects that come into the workplace, no matter what industry you're working in, is a very valuable experience, and I'm looking forward to unpacking that with you. Wendy, I'd like to turn to you next. Tell us a little bit about how your career has been shaped by the challenges and opportunities for women in the trade field, and maybe particularly it would be interesting to hear a little bit more about the Asia Society Policy Institute's Emerging Female Leaders Program and how it might address some of the things that you saw as you were coming up.
Well, first, just thanks to everyone for coming out on a Friday before a long weekend. We really appreciate it. So we're going to make this fun and interesting, right? Akiko,
Yes.
Rorry, and Joshua?
Yes, ma'am.
So hopefully you're thinking of your questions now. As Rorry mentioned, most of my career I was an international trade negotiator, and most of my negotiating experience was with Asian countries. And what I would notice, and it was hard not to notice, that I would be sitting at the head of the table for the U.S. side, and I'd look across the table to the other side, and guess what? They were all men, okay? And not only men at the front table, but they're also in the trade world, we call them backbenchers. So these are the young folks who are learning and are going to, get to that front table at some point in their careers. And even the backbenchers were men. On my side, we, in the United States, we had many more women on our delegation. And it always struck me as, this has got to change. There's got to be great women in Asia who could do this and maybe do it better. And so one of my goals when I joined the Asia Society was to figure out how could I give back. And so what I decided to do was to launch a program to bring young women from Asia to the United States for a week or so, kind of give them a crash course in what it's like to negotiate, how to sharpen your negotiating skills, learn more about trade policy, learn more about kind of the emerging issues. For example, earlier this week in Washington, we met with a great group on climate and trade and the challenges that environmental concerns are bringing to the trade arena, technology, et cetera. And so it's kind of a multifaceted program. I'm thrilled this week to have just incredible team from Japan here, 8 women. And what's so gratifying for me is when I ask them at the end of the day, which meeting was the best, or which one, if we had to get rid of one, and they all look at each other and they go, no, we want, keep them all, but also give us more free time. So that's a challenge. That's a challenge. But the other thing that's so gratifying is most of these women, they never met before they joined this program. And, we talk a lot in this world, and I'm sure we'll talk more about the importance of networking. And what I'm trying to do through this program is to establish networks among these women, have them meet women in the United States and network with those women. Because at the end of the day, a lot of career decisions and career opportunities are really based on the networks you create.
It's a very good point, Wendy. Thank you for that. I think that we will explore a little bit more like how one creates networks, perhaps in an environment that's not conducive to making those connections naturally. But wonderful to hear a little bit more about the program. Joshua, I'd like to turn to you. You occupy, I think, a position that stands as a bridge between two societies, right? You're representing here the Japan Society, we're here at the Asia Society, and I think that both of our institutions take the mission very seriously to kind of work through people-to-people connections and societal level connections on navigating what are really shared challenges, especially when it comes to gender equality and opportunity. What do you think that organizations like ours can do to better be allies for these important priorities in society that are sometimes lacking in being implemented or addressed in an urgent fashion for governments in the private sector?
I have to start by saying thank you, obviously. It wouldn't be polite otherwise. It's really great to be at Asia Society. I want to point out that while I've been here many times as president and done a lot of ceremonial things, this is the first time I'm on a panel. And I think that...
You better be good.
I know, exactly. And I won't... And normally I would make a joke the other way around, but I don't want to be the only token here, right, as the only male. So I really, especially with all the men in the audience, I want to thank you guys for being here, because I think often these conversations, which are critical, are often reduced in different ways. And without the level of attention from people that have titles like mine, I'm not important, but the institution I serve is very important in this space, and it has a role. And particularly as we talk about Japan, the role of kind of hierarchy and kind of societal pressure and power is important. Therefore, whatever you do at kind of a grassroots networking alliance level, you do need top cover. You do need kind of direct support. So I want to lend that support today and talk about why I believe this is the future in many ways, right? And it's not just because I'm a girl dad, and it's not just because I'm a certain generation. I think that from a purely self-interested economic point of view, and you look at the demographics of Japan, and you look at the amazing women before us, this is the future. And if we somehow, as people get to middle management, people begin to drop out, we are not serving the society. If you're talking about the delegations that don't have the diversity in all of its amazing forms, of which gender is a particularly acute one in the Asian and Japanese context, it matters tremendously, right? What I love about the relationship between Japan society and Asia societies, oftentimes people like to talk about our differences, right? But I like to talk about our similarities, right? In many ways, we are the older brother, but you're the bigger brother, right? And we both share this amazing legacy with John D. Rockefeller III. And when you think about kind of why we were established at the times that we were established, one right after the Russo-Japanese War, the other after World War II, it's because we were put in place to help the third way, to support government and private sectors, to be a platform, as you described, as a bridge. And I think particularly in the discussion for today, which I know we'll be getting into, that's where the conversations need to happen. If you are looking to Prime Minister Kishida to mandate change, I mean, I was joking yesterday with the group that visited, and I want to be very respectful. I see Tomoko Okuno, our Senior Director of Business and Policy, sitting there. We have some of the most amazing women working at Japan Society. And in New York, they are not afraid to tell me their viewpoints and tell me I'm wrong oftentimes. Sometimes when I go to Japan with these very same independent, strong, proud Japanese women, they will start acting differently, not in private, but in public. They'll start pouring tea for me. They'll start pouring things that I've never seen them do in the U.S. And I don't think that that's a reflection of something about that one individual. I think there's a collective action here where people begin to feel, well, when I'm in Japan, this is the way things are. And I'd love to hear Akiko's perspective on this as well, obviously. And it's easy for me to sit up here with white privilege as a male to talk about this, but it's important to call it out, and particularly as an ally to say, why is that? If you're doing that because that's what you think that your dad or your grandfather would expect of you, I have a deep respect for the culture and the tradition that's there. But in a professional environment, does that put you down, right? We were talking yesterday about some of the conferences we often go to, and it was a little bit of a shock to the system when I arrived, particularly given my age, because I was the youngest president that everyone reminded me of constantly. Because oftentimes at Japan Society, I'm sure you have the same problem in Asia Society, we always elevate whoever is the most senior person because that's the most respected person. So it's not a gender thing, it's just the respected thing. But if I'm on a panel, I have a general policy, I don't speak on panels, which is an all-male panel. That's actually really hard in Asia, right? Because often when you travel to Japan and you go to visit some of the top institutions, they put the most senior person there to honor you and to honor the honored visitor. So how do you balance the need for diversity and to make sure that the backbenchers that you described get a chance, to make sure that women are able to thrive? There are roles that are particularly important in that context. And in that context, and I've gone on too long, I just want to basically highlight that one of the things we launched at Japan Society was a women's initiative, because we realized that as Japan Society, when we did something, it allowed us to work in collaboration with our private sector partner, Japan Inc., and the government. And there was a desire and a demand signal, particularly here in New York, where it's kind of obvious that you have to do those things. It would look weird to have an all-male panel for discussions on these topics because it just doesn't fit the obvious audience or the different groups that we're talking about. And even if it does fit that in Japan, particularly the political and business environment that we're talking specifically about, there needs to be change. And I think the role of outside organizations, gaiatsu as they say in Japanese, from outside in, is particularly important. And so that the women themselves are not the ones saying, hey, put me on a panel. That doesn't look right, particularly in a Japanese context where when you raise your hand, that might not be particularly the right move. But when someone senior says, hey, I don't want to be on this panel, is there not a qualified woman here? The response has always been very positive. It's never been, how dare you, insult our culture. It's like, oh, we didn't think about that. We weren't there. So I think it's always important to give people the benefit of the doubt, but then also to kind of call things out as you see it in different contexts. So sorry for going on too long there.
No, I really appreciate your answer. I will say that Asia Society is lucky enough to have a distinguished official and female leader joining us as president and CEO on April 1. So perhaps we're the big sister now.
Yes, that is a great way to describe it. I like it.
But I think that, what I really do take away from your answer is that there's a significant role that one can play outside the system in order to kind of draw attention to issues that the system has to address. I want to get into some of those issues and particularly talk about the pressure you described for women to act certain ways in different cultures. Akiko, you've described that you've worked in many different cultures. Could you give us a little color, like how do those pressures differ across different cultures? Like in what way are we addressing kind of like a shared challenge to improve our economics, to improve our societal balance by providing opportunities for women in the workplace? And in what ways do the pressures differ and the challenges differ across these different cultures?
Yeah, thank you. So I have worked in many places and I actually haven't seen that many differences. So it's not like the US is far ahead of Japan in terms of bringing up women, although in the last few years things have improved significantly, I feel like. But every time I move to Hong Kong or London to New York, I am surprised with the few number of women at the table wherever I'm showing up. And in Japan, especially, obviously, as we all know, it's an acute issue. I was the first female executive committee member at Citi Japan, then the first female board member in Citi Japan. And Nikkei did a feature, out of the 150 years of Nikko history, because we were part of the Nikko family as well. They didn't see any female board member. Now that I've moved out of Japan, there isn't a board member there again. So, at that time, though, the gaiatsu, the pressure within the company was more about, oh, but she's really an American, she's really not Japanese. And they were able to accept that I was there because I'm not really Japanese, is what they were thinking. But by now that I've worked in London and New York and I've taken on this sort of more of an American style communication, they're never going to accept me back in the Tokyo office, is what I joke about often. But it would be very difficult for them to accept a woman sort of in that senior leadership. And that continues in a lot of places, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. Wendy, you have, again, like you've worked in a very male-dominated space. You're also a mother. You've navigated, I think, very successfully some of these work-life balance issues. Where do you think that both Japan and US could address better that kind of like gap in the middle where women are having children, but they're either leaving the workforce entirely or they're re-entering at some sort of disadvantage for having left or having these kind of different and shared responsibilities?
And I think that's a great question. And I also think that, no country has gotten this right? So in Japan, they're doing certain things right here, and they're doing certain things better than the United States. But in other areas, they could probably learn from some of our experiences, and vice versa. You know, you also raised the point before, like Prime Minister Kishida, he can't solve this problem, and I think that's so important because governments, they can help, and there's certain things that Japan has done to help. They poured more money into daycare facilities. They give very generous maternity and paternity leave. And I think now they're actually they're handing over cash to women who have babies. Now, part of this is there is a demographic challenge, and that's also not unique to Japan, and we can get into that because China's also now facing a demographic challenge, something that I never thought I would see in my lifetime. But, you know, it's interesting because in my career, I had to travel a lot. I have one son, and particularly during the U.S.-Korea free trade negotiations in the early 2000s, he was about, 8 or 9 years old. So it was an important time in his life. And I always remember wanting to call home, and depending on whether he wanted to talk to me or not, or if he was angry at me or not, that's how my day would go. And it would really bring me down if when I called in the morning my time, his the evening, and he's like, why aren't you here? If you're not going to be here, I don't want to talk to you, slam down the phone. It was tough. And having a job when you have to do a lot of international travel is tough. We had one of our senior trustees yesterday, Lulu Wang, met with the group. And one point she made, and I thought this was really interesting, and I wish she had told me this 20 years ago, was if you can bring your family more into your career and kind of make them a partner in it, and she was saying how she would send postcards from wherever she was, or she'd try and schedule her trip so she could bring her family for the remainder of the weekend. I thought that was really great advice. But again, just back to my point, I think the government can do certain things, but it has to be all hands on deck, which means culturally at home, you need the support, but also in the office, you need the support. And you not only need the support from the top, but you need the support from the middle managers as well. I remember reading something where at Microsoft, there was a policy, this is like 20 years ago when Bill Gates was still CEO, and they were, allowing people to kind of leave to pick up their kids or go to a school play or whatever. But it wasn't until Bill Gates left and actually went to a soccer game of one of his kids, he set the example, and then people felt more comfortable following. And I'll just kind of wrap up and say that's my understanding on paternity care benefits in Japan. That it's one thing for the government to say you have them, but if the culture in your company is, if you take it, you're going to be viewed very differently. So again, all hands on deck, all of society on deck to make this work.
Thanks, Wendy. I think that's a really good point, and it not only kind of reflects, my own experience as well as being a woman in foreign policy industry that's typically male dominated, having kids, having a very hectic job, and there is always a sense that you can't do everything as well as you want to, and that is a really challenging personal barrier to success. And I think it's something that we don't talk about very much, and we should talk more openly about. Joshua, if I can assume, I think you and I are of approximately the same generation, and I think for us it's we've grown up in a time as millennials, perhaps elder millennials, where women have had a lot of opportunities in the workforce, but it hasn't necessarily translated into more advancement. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit also from your personal experience, why do you think that what do you think we could be doing better to kind of connect the dots between okay, you have the opportunities, as Wendy said, you have the paternity leave available to you, but people aren't really taking advantage of them, or seeing them in the same way. where do you think kind of like the challenges lie and how could we address them?
Yeah, I mean, yesterday when we were talking, and I think all these points are particularly acute, and it's something that I don't pretend to understand as a male that has certain privileges, right? And I think that there is a double standard, particularly for parents, right? As a father, I think the statistics are very clear. Like when you know, all the guilt you talked about, the mom guilt, it's very real. Dads don't have that same level, right? It's kind of like when you call and your son doesn't want to talk to you, or my daughter is always mad at me for something. That just seems to be the nature of daughters and dads. You kind of just accept it and you go right back into it. It doesn't have that same emotional resonance, which maybe is the way that God created us. But I think it's important to recognize the impact it has. And particularly as someone who's been able to be in a position of leadership, I think the point about modeling that behavior is really important. But I think it's easy to always criticize. I think millennials are very good at pointing out problems. And as a society, I think Americans are particularly good at pointing out problems and not necessarily offering solutions, right? And so I think that oftentimes, as a son of a preacher, there's a feeling that we are preaching to the rest of the world, do it our way. And yet, actually, if you looked at the world, you might say it might be better to do it the Japanese way, right? And so there are real problems, as you pointed out. And, you know, I think about, you know, people like Shinjiro Koizumi, who made headlines for when he did take paternity leave and was criticized very heavily, particularly among certain right-wing groups. And you're kind of like, how can you criticize someone for wanting to be more than just fill in the blank? And I think all of us struggle with the work-life balance of how much can we bring our family into our career and how much can our career drive our own personal motivations? Because when I look at my grandparents who, you know, did not have college degrees and, you know, fought in World War II, and think about my parents as missionaries who've served in Japan for 42 years, and I look at what I'm doing, it's not that any one of us has a better title or had a better experience. At the end of my grandparents' life, what they valued most was their family. And I've worked for some very important people that don't have those families. I would say, honestly, maybe the reason I feel so strongly about this topic in particular is my best bosses have always been women, right? And there's an empathy and an emotional connection, and when I was having my kids, an understanding that men just didn't seem to have. And I don't want to be one of those leaders, right? And I think the challenge, though, is putting it into a context of a work environment. It's very easy, as Josh would have personal views on things. But suddenly, as the president, you start making exceptions or rules or everything else. And there's this real challenge we have of individual versus collective. And I think Japanese society privileges the collective. The whole must be harmonious versus the individual freedom that many Americans privilege. And you saw this play out in spades with COVID in terms of the debates about masks, which were not a thing in Japan. But in America, if you try to make me wear this mask, I'm going to, tell you my political views on things. But I think to your larger point, how do we balance that? And I think the point you're making is an even bigger one, which is that, in this generation, my wife works full-time as well as the chief of staff at Goodwill, a very big nonprofit. How can you possibly hope to be a parent like her mom was to her or my mom was to me? Because they lived in a different generation, a different era. We want to model what we see, and we want to be that version of our parents, and yet the environment we see ourselves in is very different. We have more tools to be connected than we ever have, and yet we're more lonely than we've ever been, right? And I think that is directly affecting all the areas. So it's easy to kind of zoom in and say, look how far behind this country, this society is in the way it treats women. The same can be said about other minority groups, and the same can be said in terms of like, okay, what do we want to privilege, being a parent or being a professional? And I think, Anne-Marie Slaughter, who talked about trying to have it all, there's a whole debate there, and I don't think we've gotten it right. I think Americans sometimes lean too heavily on the work side and maybe don't focus on the family side like many other traditional societies would.
Can I just? I was just going to jump in to say that with the COVID pandemic, though, there were many, sort of tragedies around the world, but one silver lining, if you were to find one, is that we have all learned that actually we can work remotely and that hybrid is okay. So there's no stigma, or hopefully there isn't any more stigma attached to, I'd like to be, on a flexible work arrangement, right? In the past, in Japan, if you ask that, that's it. Then why don't you go part-time? Then you don't get paid, you don't get the benefits. Same thing even in a law firm. When I was a law firm associate, if you were to ask for a part-time, then you're never going to be, you're on a mommy track, you're not on a partner track, you're never going to make partner. So it's really hard to ask. But today, if you were to ask for, I like to work from home twice a week, that's what everybody is doing. And a lot of the companies at Citi, we allow that. So it's not considered a stigma. And so I think it would be a missed opportunity for all the corporates around the world if we don't reimagine the workforce and the future of the workforce using this flexible work arrangement. And that should help with the work-life balance that, we are forever trying to find.
Yeah, I mean, particularly in Japan, and I think it's maybe more in the public sector than the private sector, but the expectation of working really long hours. And I remember when I used to negotiate, there's a 12, 13, 14-hour time difference. And we could call our counterparts like midnight their time, and they're all still in the office ready to do a conference call with us. Like that, how that's not a family-friendly policy. So hopefully through COVID, Japan is realizing, as well as some organizations here, that the ability to telecommute, the ability to work remotely, particularly late at night and on conference calls, you don't need all to be together in the same room. Can I just say something on work-life balance? And I think one of the lessons when we bring delegations of young women here, and we meet with a lot of people, a lot of different women, senior, mid-career, junior. It seems like one of the themes is all women face this challenge, and I'm of the view there is no answer here. And so, sometimes I think when some of the women will ask questions, well, how do you do it? How do you balance? And the answer always is, I don't do a great job. And so what I try and tell people is that we need to kind of not strive for perfection. And we need to realize that on certain days, we're going to be good at work, but we're going to disappoint our family. On other days, we're going to put our family needs ahead of our work needs. But to try and do both consistently, if you try and do that, it's kind of a challenge you're not going to, it's a goal you're not going to be able to achieve. And so a lot of times you just kind of like let the pressure off yourself and just do the best you can under the circumstances.
Yeah, I think that's...
Can I just pick up on that point real quickly and then give it right to you? I just want to reinforce my dear senpai's point. In the Japanese concept of kintsugi, right? It is that the imperfection makes perfection. And I think if we could all be a little bit more zen about this, which is why I think the world is so looking for a Japanese deeper philosophical understanding, but how do you apply that in the context of what we're describing, which we'll be going into. Sorry.
No, by all means. Like, I think it's a really salient point that there are actually philosophical traditions about balance and about imperfection and celebrating differences that are not just, unique to Japanese culture, but also that's part of American individualism too, right? To say that we're all on our kind of own journey, facing our own pressures, and the goal is not to be perfect, but to just try the best you can every day. And that, I think, is a really important sentiment and point of consideration, but there are these kind of bigger, larger issues, right? When you're in the U.S., I think the cost of childcare is insane right now. I think for people of my own generation, the rising cost of living and relatively stagnant wages have forced a lot of family decisions about one parent working because, frankly, like the cost of childcare for 2 kids in this city would be more than a mortgage, rent. Certainly more than the 7% of income that the Biden administration identified as the proper amount for childcare. I mean, we're laughing because that would be laughable in living in most places in the United States, and it's not specific to big cities. So, some of these challenges do need to be met by government programs, whether it's subsidization or it's, finding other types of efficiencies. I wonder if any of our panelists have thoughts on what kind of government programs could back up claims or government initiatives to promote more gender equality in the workforce, and maybe not even just gender equality, but promote better work-life balance for everyone.
So if I could just comment on that daycare issue, because to prepare for this panel, I've been speaking to different people because my kids are already 21 and 24. So when I was looking for hoikuen in Japan, that's like 20 years ago. And so back then it was like impossible to get in, and that was the key issue. Everybody was moving to a place where they think they could get in. They had to move their houses. Now apparently that's not as an acute issue as it used to be. And the hoikuen sort of monthly fee is still, relatively speaking, low. And it's on a sliding scale of your salary, right? So it matches sort of what you can afford. And so even if you had 3 kids and you put them all into nurseries, it's not going to break your bank. Whereas in the US or in Manhattan, just one child's daycare monthly fee is astronomical compared to the Japanese. So there are some things that the Japanese government is doing well. That's the good news. I think there are other things that would help with like the pay gap, right? Because I'm on the National Women's Law Center, as Rorry introduced me. And there the survey is that we in the United States still have the pay gap issue. So if you include the full-time and part-time women employees in the workforce, women make 78 cents for every dollar men make. And that's still today in the United States. So in Japan must be sort of similar issue. How do you close that gap? And I think what actually started to work better is that state by state, there are different laws that are being put in place. So in New York, in 2020, they ban asking what your salary is today. When you're applying for a new job, you can't ask, how much are you making for a city? We'd be like, how much are you making at JP Morgan? And then we'll just add a little bit to that, right? But that perpetuates the pay gap issue. And so if you're not allowed to say that, you're not going to be able to compare women's salary versus men's salary and add a little bit just to entice that woman to come. So that really helps. Then in 2023, there's also the pay transparency law that came into place in New York, where you have to announce how much you're willing to pay for a particular job. So that regardless of whether you're a woman or man, you've already announced it. So you have to pay within that range. And that also helps with a pay gap. And I think those things will help with the work-life balance eventually, because it's empowering women to have more dollars to work with.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. There's something about, I think there's something bigger here about transparency of issues, being able to talk openly about these things, not as a, like, I've got you, you know, you've done something wrong, but really to discuss, like, what are the practical implications of hiding or downplaying the lack of opportunities for gender equality. That's really important. Wendy, other thoughts on what governments can do or what governments can do in partnership with private sector?
Yeah, I mean, maybe just to turn the conversation a little, I think one thing is also really important is to have women in senior positions, both in the private sector and the public sector. And this is an area where Japan does not score very well. The World Economic Forum has annual surveys where they look at like 160 countries, and they evaluate efforts towards gender equality based on a lot of different metrics. Japan does really well on the education metric, and that gets their number up. But what really brings the number down is the lack of women in the Diet, in the cabinet. I don't think there's ever been a female prime minister, not that I can remember.
And it's only going down every year on year.
But what's interesting is Japan's ranking, even after Abenomics and some of the cool stuff they're doing, it's 120. They're at 125 of 160 countries. And when you look at even in Asia, who they're coupled with, it's now I can't remember the 2 countries. One was Myanmar, but another small country in Asia. Japan can do better there, and I think that that the need to not only, you know, just for token's sake to have more women in senior level positions, but it's really important to have more diversity of views, and, you know, to make better policy, to make better corporate decisions. So I think that's one area where if I were, you know, to be asked where Japan maybe can learn from the U.S., this is one area. We had the great opportunity earlier this week to meet with Young Kim. She is a Korean representative from California who now is chairman of the Indo-Pacific Subcommittee of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Wow, was she impressive. We were only with her for 15 minutes, and I think I see a lot of my colleagues nodding. It was a very impactful meeting, and just her charisma and her dedication, and the fact that she could find time to meet, even, you know, for a short period of time. But you know, I think we're doing a much better job in the U.S. in electing female representatives and senators. We've yet to have a president too, but who knows?
Vice president.
I'm looking around. I don't think we have
vice president. We have a
vice president. Right,
And
right,
an
right.
Asian American vice president at that, which is something
And a
to
cabinet that's extremely diverse.
Agreed, yeah.
But you were saying in Japan, if anything, there are almost fewer women in the cabinet.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that we're getting close to asking for audience questions. Please do be thinking about raising your hand here. But before we do that, I just want to turn to you, Joshua. Any reflections on what you're hearing in this round of conversation, or other things the government could do or lead to kind of help advance this issue?
Yeah, I mean, I want to say amen to what I've heard, right? I think that the question is, how do we have more of these conversations? Because I think they are important, right? The fact that Asia Society is doing this in such a public way and streaming it, and all of you are interested in this, is an important part. Because I actually think that the way you're going to see change is not that you're going to have some visionary leader that comes out and declares Womenomics, right? Because that was great, and Kathy Matsui is a good friend. But that is not going to change unless there's pressure, particularly in democracies, right? This is not a dear leader thing where we just need a good dear leader who happens to be a feminist, right? You're going to need society to demand change. And I think we were talking yesterday about the fact that it's one thing to have a leader that is progressive and has these mindset, but oftentimes it's the middle where things get lost. And oftentimes it's not just the men or the discrimination or the other things that some bad individual, bad actor, it's the collective society that has been built in a certain way that privileges certain things. So to go to your point, I think Japan does pay attention very closely to these indicators and wants to figure out a way to reform, particularly if they're comparing themselves to Korea, right? They don't want to be next to Myanmar and Afghanistan or all these other countries that are at the lower level because they know they can do better. But the challenge is, unlike in the US context where it's fairly easy to be diverse because it's a very diverse society to begin with, in a Japanese context, diversity is reduced to gender, right? And then it becomes almost like the way you started that question, are you a bad guy just for being a man built in a certain area? And if you don't bring those men along with you, the change is not going to be as fully impactful, right? And I think that's why conversations like this, where you've invited me to be part of the conversation and for us to be able to kind of practice what we preach, which is incredibly different. Just ask my wife, right? And I think that we have to be able at the government level to hold our leaders accountable. So if they say they're going to do this by 2030, let's hold them accountable at 2030. They got a long way to go. And it seems unlikely, just looking at the numbers right now, that they're going to go from where they are today to Scandinavian standards. So how do we help and not beat people up along the way, but create the right incentive structure? Because I think I don't think women are asking for handouts, right? Like, you guys are perfectly capable of taking what is yours. And when it comes to having those negotiations with the rules that are in place, everything else, when I look at my students that I teach at Columbia, it's always the women that are going to do better, and the Japanese women in particular, right? The question is, do they ever go back? Because sometimes they come, they get a taste, and they're like, I'm not dealing with that, right? I'm going to stay here, and I'm going to just, contribute to this society, which is great. But the value of U.S.-Japan in many ways is that we can benefit and work with each other. So there's a whole series of things that I think in some ways there is the macro that needs to change, to your point. But I think each of us can be part of that change we want to see, and in our own lives try to impact whatever it is, as a parent, as an employer, as a manager. How can we do that to create that environment and always try to understand the other person's shoes in some ways?
If I could add, I think the reality of the situation is the pressures are coming from demographic trends and from slow economic growth. And so it's a really win-win proposition to have more women not only in the workplace, because I think if the latest statistics I've seen, that from the percentage-wise, more Japanese women work than U.S. women. The labor participation is higher, but it's the quality of
the types of jobs.
Right.
That they're
I was going to say the quality of the
Yeah.
participation, right?
Yeah.
Like the temporary workers. Yeah. But because of demographic challenges and the need for economic growth, this is an important untapped market. The other two tools that governments look to are using to deal with these demographic challenges are technology, frankly, and immigration. But women are, again, and here Kathy Matsui was really a pioneer in this area, pointing that out to Prime Minister Abe and having that take on. I just want to say one thing about, China is facing demographic challenges. which again is, the past 2 years, there's a net, their population is shrinking. Now it's still 1.4 billion people, so it's a lot of people. But China is facing, the trends that we see in China are not going to get better unless something happens. What I find fascinating, though, is instead of finding ways to integrate women into the workplace more effectively, Xi Jinping is basically saying to women, stay home and have babies. And somehow, I just don't think that's going to be resonating among the young women in China who are, I'm not going to say the word that we heard all week, but in other words, to, a badass woman, that women are like almost,
I said ambitious, which is the official panel version of that.
What's interesting in Japan, I think, is that we have the birth rate issue, but the working women are the ones that are giving birth, right? Because are giving birth more than the stay-at-home moms, because you have the economic power, but also the hoikuens are not as expensive. So you can put 2 or 3 kids there, and it's still not going to add up to the New York City, daycare cost on a monthly basis. So I do think that, continuing to work is important. I do think that taking ownership of your own career is also important, and not focusing on work-life balance, but trying to kind of find your own voice within your environment. Also, HR policy in sort of raising awareness of these unconscious bias among men and having men involved in these diversity pillars, like at Citi in Japan, our country chief officer, Marc Louet, who is a Frenchman, is the one that's leading the diversity effort. So you need to have tone from the top being the right tone, as well as sort of so that it sort of distills down, and then all the training and awareness within the organization.
So we have covered so much. You can tell that our speakers are incredibly passionate about these issues. If you are interested in learning a little bit more about China's demographic challenges and how people in society are reacting to them, Asia Society Policy Institute does have a paper on our website on antinatalism in China. It's fantastic. Speaks a little bit more about, less about women in participation in the workforce and more about how people are opting out of societal pressure as a whole, whether that's buying an apartment, getting married, et cetera, because of some of the kind of societal trends inside China and the turn toward authoritarianism. So I highly recommend it if you're interested in China's demographic challenges. I also think we've kind of skirted on the issue, but I'd like to say it up front that there is another way that people in this audience, people watching online, people who are going to view this later can help and participate is by really outlining the value proposition of women's economic power. I think that our particularly in the United States, we've been a little slow to wake up to the purchasing power of women. I don't say this just because I'm a Kansas City Chiefs fan, but this Taylor Swift phenomenon of having people, of her being able to kind of like come in and boost a local economy so much. We see this trend as well in movies, movies with female stars, Barbie, for example, outperforming at the box office some of the traditional films. So I think there's also, something we should talk about and work on in terms of making sure that the value proposition to the top is clear, that women know what women want. And when you have women at the top helping to set the agenda for the products that you want people to consume, you're going to win. So with all that said, I'd like to open up for a short amount of audience questions. Please raise your hand. Oh, good. We'll start right here and then move this way. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We've learned a lot, and my name is Yui Tanaka. I'm from McDonald's Japan, and I would like to ask you about how to get the buying at home, especially from the husband. So I have a husband who cannot speak English at all, and who's working in engineering. So most of his colleagues all men, and who doesn't watch news at all, and so I bet that he doesn't. Yeah, he cannot name the American presidents. So he's not exposed to this societal change or what's going on in women and workplace issues. And then I have been dreaming of working abroad for 20 years. And when I talked about it to my husband, he just thought like 2 seconds. And his answer is, well, it's difficult, and that's it. And I just completely kill that off. So how should I communicate or get the buy-in from my husband to, well, work outside or working abroad or more internationally, work more internationally? So that's my question.
Okay, let's have one person answer that, then we'll collect all the rest of the questions and go to all of you. So,
Sure. Well, even at Citi, we have noticed that during COVID, among our MD population, the managing director population, we lost a lot of female Asian MDs during COVID. And the reason is because at home, they've had to do a lot more the child care, elderly care, and the education and everything else than the other female MDs had to do. So we lost a lot during that time, and we realized that the problem is, it's not just about us, but at home, they are under that cultural pressure that they can't resist, right? So that's an issue everywhere in the Asian societies. I really think it's just communication and just trying to get his understanding. If he had a sister or mother or somebody within his also close orbit that also works to kind of band with that person and explain is also another thing, but eventually they will come around. I think it's just, it takes a long time to change a man's, sort of cultural thinking, right? It's not easy to change anybody's personality. So it takes a village, but you could enlist his mother or enlist anybody around him to try to get him to see your point of view too.
I really like that. There's an army of women around him that can help influence it. I think also, just you have so passionately explained why it's important to you. I think having that conversation with your husband too, like, why is this important to me as a person? He married you. He loves you. He wants you to be happy.
Yeah, and the reason why I said it is because at Citi we noticed that back in the day, it was very, very hard to get men's support, right, in the diversity efforts. But the moment their own daughters start to work and they see that their own daughters are being discriminated, they're like, wait, what are we doing at Citi? Why aren't we doing more? And all of a sudden I'm like, is your daughter now like post-college age? And sure enough, it is, right? So it does matter when it's so close to their heart.
Okay, let's collect the rest of our questions, and I will give every speaker a chance to address this or other issues. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4. That's all we can take. Let's start in the back with Tomoko, please.
Hi, my name is Tomoko Okuno. I work for Japan Citi with Joshua. Thank you so much for this fascinating discussion. I really appreciate your honest observation and advice drawn from your own experience. I just realized I forgot to pack my daughter's swimsuit for her swim class. So I'm trying to do my best, but I'm not perfect, but thank you for your advice. I'm going to continue to do my best. My question for you is like there are so many women's initiatives out there, and I think we all try to make impact, to make change, especially for male-dominated society. And I'm sure it depends on the specific goal that you have for your program, but like where do you think that we should target for the most impact for Japanese organization in particular? Because as Yamahara-san mentioned, there is still like, we need to sort of engage men to make change for women's career trajectory. And I understand it's important to engage men. And in that case, like, should we target like C-suites or like HR practitioners, like people who are engaged in diversity programs?
Okay, thank you. Next question, please. 1, 2, 3. We'll come to the front in just 1 second.
Hi, I'm Catherine from Bloomberg News. I'm not going to write a story. I'm just here for out of personal interest because I have worked in Tokyo for 5 years. You mentioned demographics toward the end of your discussion, and my question is, it has something to do with that because when the birth rate falls, the conventional wisdom kind of goes like the birth rate falls because women become more educated, they become more assertive, they have more paths in life open up to them rather than having to become stay-at-home moms. And then yet I felt the female empowerment level in Japan doesn't quite back that up. So Japan became richer quicker than any other country in Asia. The birth rate in Japan started falling quicker than, before any other country in Asia. You would expect Japan to be so much ahead of the rest of Asia when you just look at it from that point of view, but it's not. Thank you for sharing the stats, but kind of at Myanmar level. So I was wondering, why is that? And maybe that would provide some insight on like how to fix that problem.
Thank you. Two more questions here, and right here, yes, thank you.
Hi, I'll try and talk fast. Thank you. I'm an Asia Society member. Sorry, Brother Josh. My question is, my background is market research way back. And what stuck out with everything very positive, this panel, it's great. What stuck out in my hand with the stats, directions, political versus economic trends? I'm wondering why the one, which is cabinets in Japan, it was brought up that that's going down. I've always learned when I started out in market research, you look at what's going down and backwards maybe and pay attention. So I'm wondering what's going on with that and the reason you would attribute to that downward trend of women presence in the cabinet. I said that right, in
Yes,
Japan.
you did. Thank you. Okay, one final question, and then we'll get the speakers' views on all of these.
Hi, thank you for this rich discussion. My question is for Joshua. I think of Japan society as being a cultural institution with art exhibitions and film programs and that sort of thing. So how is there a conscious effort that the organization makes, and maybe this applies to Asia society as well, in terms of kind of shifting those kinds of art exhibitions? And I know you had one featuring very powerful women artists. Is that a conscious decision by the organization to put women at the forefront in your art, in your film, in your performances, to kind of carry on this conversation that transcends government and policy?
Thank you very much for that. Okay, so we have 4 questions. I'm going to read them all off once for you all, and then we'll just go straight. We'll actually come this way. I think we'll go to you first, Joshua. So first question is just women's initiatives, like where can we make the most impact and change? Is it C-suite? Is it HR? Is it strategy? How do we better engage men in the women's initiatives to create more allies? Second question on demographics, like why is there a trend of Japan's economic success on the one hand, but kind of a backwards trend on women's participation on the other? Third, just in terms of like looking at it from the perspective of like kind of the biggest gaps or dips in women's workforce participation, how to explain the downward trend of women in high-level government positions, particularly cabinet-level positions. And then finally, as a cultural institution, are there opportunities to kind of put women at the forefront and the center, to center women's stories and art as part of this challenge? And since that last question was directed specifically to you, Joshua, start there.
Sure. I don't want to do too much PR for Japan Society, so let me make it more broadly from Susan's great question. It's interesting. I don't come from the arts and culture background. That will not surprise any of you, as many people have pointed out to me. But there's a reason I chose to come here and to be the president of Japan Society, because I believe that is where the future lies, and also where some of the answers might lie as well. When you look at the incredible history of the 117 years of Japan Society and the things we're most known for, which you rightly pointed out, the first kind of dedicated visual arts space to Japanese visual arts, where people like Yayoi Kusama kind of cut their chops and got a fellowship, where people like Yoko Ono, who was just recently featured with Japanese women in Fluxus, there has been a very clear focus there, but I think in general the arts and culture community is much more engaging and much more embracing of kind of all areas. And there's a fluidity to it, right? Where we've had some things that were probably a little uncomfortable for some of our corporate members, particularly our Japanese corporate members at times, and I've heard about it. But I think there's benefit in being able to lean on that, because I would argue that just like we're talking about women as being a smart political and business demographic to focus on, not just purely from the moral point of view or kind of gender equality, I think arts and culture is really where Japan's strength lie. I've talked and written a lot about Japan as a superpower in culture, right? Take architects, take visual artists, take kind of the anime and Zen mindfulness meditation. But Japan's not very good at commoditizing. It's really bad at PR, so it needs a lot of help on marketing itself. And I think in this particular area, to go to your point, I wish that we could take credit for having a conscious and clear plan here. But really, up until a couple years ago, when Okuno-san kind of really spearheaded our women's initiative, these were being done because of the great initiatives of our leaders. And I think, as you know very well, the majority of our leaders, and particularly program directors, are Japanese women. So I don't think there's a connection here, right? And so when you look at our performing arts program, which was led by Beatrice, Serrata Gordon, she's the person that wrote the Japanese Constitution and put in women's rights way before the society was ready under Douglas MacArthur. She was our performing arts founding director. So there's a deep connection to that. And I think a lot of it is not just arts and culture, but it's New York City as well. The fact that we're headquartered here, just like Asia Society is, puts a certain imprint on it. So my hope would be that we can be more intentional going forward. And I think, as Tomoko just asked, how can we have an impact, right? Because when we talk about the business community, they often pay very close attention. They want to be very close to the producer of Barbie. They want to be able to invest in things that women will then pay for, and whether that's a Shiseido or a Tiffany's that we featured as well in these conversations, there's a lot going on there. And the last part is, it's not just the business and policy, arts, and culture, it's also the education piece. All of us have talked about the importance of the next generation. And I think engaging the next generation of leaders is so important. And I think on the US-Japan side, that's critically important because of demographics, and also because I've never seen Japan be more popular on the popular space, the Macy's Day Parade with Pikachu and Goku, and yet less appreciation and deep understanding of Japan. There's a generational shift happening. We've got to raise that awareness, not just from the popular, but into the practical in many ways. And I'm hoping that's what Japan Society can do with your and everyone's help here as well.
Great. Wendy, over to you, maybe
Yeah, so
specifically.
let me just take a different question, and just to say, and I want to leave on, I always promise myself that whenever I'm on a panel, I'm going to leave on a very optimistic tone, because I've been on so many panels where we're talking about Ukraine, the Mideast, or whatever, and China, Taiwan, and you leave and you're like, oh my God, the world's falling apart. I think one of the problems so far, a problem in Japan, but I think it's going to be remedied over time, is there's a shallow pool of senior level women to put in these positions. And so I'm always struck when, Japan makes a big effort to put more women on their corporate boards. But then, there are 5 or 10 women who are on 30 boards, 4 or 5 boards. It's the same women, right?
Right.
But I think over time, and based on my experience, just in the public sector too, I opened up and I said the backbench was all male when I started negotiating. Now, not only is the backbench more and more female, but there are more and more females at the table. And I think that's just inevitable. I think the 8 women who are here, they're symbols of that. And so I think that over time, we will see more women in key political positions in Japan.
Fantastic.
And corporate positions.
Of course.
Yeah.
Highly important. Akiko,
So
the last
focusing on what companies can do, right? I mean, we are part of the 30% Club globally, as well as in Japan. There are 2 different sort of initiatives. The Global 30% Club is, 30% by whatever year at the corporate board and executive level. They met that back in 2021 already. So it's past 30%. In Japan, I think it's 19.6 or something as of last year. You're almost there, 20%, just another 10%. But like Wendy said, it's all the same people. But having somebody to look up to as a role model helps the younger woman imagine what it might be like, right? Whereas if you didn't have anyone, when I was coming up the ranks, I didn't have anyone. And I said to Wendy, I wish I had someone like you when I was coming up, so that I could be on these delegations and meeting all the, listening to all the great stories. But to have enough people there will give you a way to think about which paths you want to take, what might be possible for yourself, right? And it does take a village. So the question that I received earlier before we started this from you guys is, how about then in the middle management piece? How can we make a difference? And it's not just the 30% Club where you're focused on the board and the executive management, but how do we sort of instill that everywhere else? What we do is we make sure that every single open position, when you need to promote somebody in there, you have to have a diverse candidate on the slate within the company. And you have to go through an interview process. I mean, it's ridiculous. Within the same company, you have to prepare your resume, you go through an interview, but you have to have a diverse person. In Tokyo, that only means woman, because there's no other diversity, right? Elsewhere in the world, you think of other minority men as well, and that didn't move the needle. So we were like, why is it moving the needle? So we said, you need 2 diverse candidates. Maybe they just put 1 woman in there just to have that check, but they're actually going to choose whoever they like. But now we demanded that you have to have 2 diverse candidates, and still not moving the needle. We are now saying the interviewers need to be diverse. So you have to include 2 diverse interviewers. So I'm busy interviewing because there aren't that many women MDs around to interview another MD candidate. But that is what we're doing, and we do make a difference by forcing the issue and making the women also go through these interviews to say, raise your hand and say that you want that position. Because a lot of times we don't do that. We don't do enough for ourselves, right? Whereas men are busily advocating for themselves. So we need to do that more. It takes a village, and it also is within your power too.
I love that. I want to end with the mindset shift that you should, as a woman, look at decisions and say, what would a man do in this exact same situation? And try to empower and invest yourself with that confidence and ambition. Thank you guys so much for sticking with us here a little over time. If you would like to continue this conversation, perhaps a little bit more broadly across all of Asia, we will have another program on March 8th here at the Asia Society for International Women's Day, tackling the unfinished business of gender equality. We do have an amazing Japanese woman on that program, who's the managing executive officer of Itochu Corporation, as well as people from other areas of Asia and the UN system. So please do come back for that. Follow us online, Asia Society Policy Institute, Asia Society New York, and sign up to be a member if you haven't already. Thank you so much, and please, a final thank you to our panelists.